I'm Saraya Wintersmith. Tonight on Greater Boston, Harvard and MIT are both threatening protesters with suspensions as encampments continue near commencement day. Two reporters join me with the latest. Then, why experts now recommend women start getting regular breast cancer screenings 10 years sooner. And finally, Massachusetts makes it to the big screen in The Challengers. We'll hear about how the filmmakers brought Boston to Hollywood. Protesters at MIT are resisting efforts to take down their encampment more than a day after the university set a deadline for its removal. Officials at Harvard are making similar demands, threatening widespread suspensions if students don't clear Harvard Yard. Both encampments have been up for roughly 2 weeks, with protesters calling for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza and demanding the schools divest from Israel as its military invades the city of Rafah, which is now home to 1.5 million refugees. GBH News' Hannah Reale was at the MIT encampment last night. She joins me, along with student journalist Cam Kettles, who's been covering the protests for the Harvard Crimson. Hannah?
Nice
Cam,
seeing you.
Ladies, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having us.
Cam, at least one of the demonstrations has now gone beyond encampments on school grounds. The Crimson reported that about 400 students marched to the home of the interim president, Alan Garber, after he refused to negotiate with them. And that rally came hours after Garber issued a warning about indefinite consequences. What can you tell me about the Crimson's coverage of that rally, and how determined do you think students there are to stand their ground if it does come to police response?
I mean, the rally came at a very critical moment for the protest. It's been 14 days now. Yesterday was day 13, and the protesters had first set their own deadline that Garber had to come to the table by 5 p.m. yesterday. Obviously, that didn't happen, and the threat of being forcibly taken off campus, I think, is definitely something that students are more concerned about now. The protest yesterday was one of the first that was outside the yards itself. Part of that is because affiliates, non-affiliates cannot get in, and so it was much bigger for that reason. There were no limitations. You know, everyone yesterday was sort of wondering the big question, would the encampment continue? And that's a question that protesters at their press conference yesterday avoided that question, but they're still at the encampment. And so the protest was definitely a signal that they're still there, and that, you know, as long as escalation would continue from the Harvard administration, it would continue from the protesters.
And did the escalation do anything to the mood on campus? What's it been like generally?
I mean, I think it's very uncertain. The next 24 hours, I think, is going to be a very critical point. Obviously, you know, the protest was energized, and there are people that are willing to stay. Obviously, the protest didn't take place at the encampment, so we don't know the number of people that are still in the tents. But we do know they have a lot of support from the student body and from, you know, Cambridge residents that are willing to make the trek there and to protest in front of President Garber's house.
Hannah Reale, I'm turning to you now. We know at this hour the encampment there at Harvard is still there, and at MIT the students re-established the encampment after appearing to vacate. You were there. Where do things stand across the rest of the Boston area universities, and what have you heard from folks populating the encampments?
Sure. So at MIT, yeah, I was there yesterday. They had started to vacate, but there were still some students or some demonstrators who were in the encampment. There were hundreds of people who had gathered outside, and also law enforcement from Cambridge Police, State Police, Campus Police. Around 5:30, students and demonstrators broke down the fences that were surrounding that area and returned to the encampment. There were a couple hundred people there. I went back today, and there are still several dozen students there. I spoke with one organizer yesterday who said that it was really galvanizing for the community. There had been threats of suspensions from the MIT administration that went out yesterday if they had not vacated by 2:30. And she basically said that this had really energized the movement, and although they had initially vacated, they were going back, and their demands would be consistent, which is that they want MIT to sever research ties with Israel, which the administration has said that it would violate academic freedom, and they would not do. So that's
what can you tell me about the mood and the police presence there? Tense, peaceful?
Yesterday, tense. Today, much calmer. You know, the fence has gone back up. That's been reestablished. Yesterday, there were as I said, after 5:30, when they retook the encampment area, which is, a lawn on campus, there were a couple hundred students at the encampment. Today, not quite as many, but still several dozen students, several dozen demonstrators. And there were at one point several hundred people chanting alongside outside, and I saw at least 3 dozen officers. At one point, I just stopped, did a head count, turning around 360, and saw at least 36, at least 3 dozen officers from various law enforcement agencies. So there was certainly a heavy police presence and a heavy law enforcement presence yesterday. Today, not so much. Things have already, it seems, calmed down. And as far as students have told me, no suspensions have actually been issued yet.
And then what's your sense of how much of the folks are students versus potential outside infiltrators?
I don't have a sense of infiltrators. I did speak with one organizer who said yesterday that since, Emerson and Northeastern tents and encampments have been cleared at this point, that there are certainly students from local colleges who are there in support, but a lot of people that I've spoken to are MIT students affiliated with the university who are at the encampment and are asking for their school to divest.
This next question is for either of you, just because it seems like university administrators are struggling to respond to these encampments, not just here, but nationwide. And yet, in our backyard at the Rhode Island School of Design, the students took a building that contained the offices of some of the administrators, and their president and their provost met with them. And they haven't called police so far, even though police are aware of the protest. And then we've also seen that Brown, Northwestern, and the University of Minnesota have, to some degree, agreed to look into the school's investment policies. You two, with folks who have great insight into this situation, have you thought about what it would mean for a school president or some other high-level administrator to sit down at the negotiating table with students?
I mean, Harvard is unique in that it comes into this already being in the public spotlight for 7 months now. Interim President Garber has really had the approval of community members for the last 4 months of his tenure, but he's in a very, very tricky situation because on one hand, they only have 3 demands: disclose, divest, and to drop charges against protesters. And it's very difficult for him to meet any of those without it sending a major signal to the alumni and the donors that he's been trying to win back from, the chaos that was last semester. And so, Harvard is also under a congressional investigation. And so all of these factors make it very, very hard for him to actually sit down at the negotiating table. He hasn't even gone to meet with the protesters. College administrators have, but yesterday's statement that these protesters are facing involuntary leave is his first statement about the protests since they began.
Hannah, to that point, it does set up a potential clash with donors who don't like the idea of divesting or who just don't like the way a university is responding to protests.
Yeah, there's MIT, I think, is in a slightly different situation in that there have been some negotiations and conversations with demonstrators, but what seemed to actually prompt the email that went out to students yesterday saying they would face suspension is that those talks seem to pretty rapidly break down. And yeah, we have seen at other universities such as Columbia where Bob Kraft basically threatened to withhold donations given the way that the university had handled what was happening there. There have certainly been major issues at various campuses, and MIT's president also put out a statement several days back saying, we have heard a lot of messages from basically every direction that are fundamentally irreconcilable, from parents, students, alumni, donors, faculty, staff, that they have gotten such strong directives and asks from every direction that there's no way to satisfy both sides or every side.
And I'll end by asking both of you, do we have any reason to suspect that we'll see students escalate again in the way that they arguably did in Harvard's case by taking the protests off of the encampment and to the home of someone that they want an audience with?
I think we don't know at this point what they'll do next. Obviously, President Garber has stated very clearly that there's a very high bar for police presence. We don't know what that bar is, and neither do the protesters. And so from their calculus, escalation might mean equal escalation from the university, but at the moment, they're still camping. And that, I think is the signal that they're determined.
Hannah, anything to add?
Yeah, when I've asked what's next, I mean, their demands are consistent with MIT, so it's basically we will stay here until MIT has divested. And from what I saw yesterday, they were willing and ready to be arrested at various points. I saw several protesters writing a phone number to call in case they were arrested and, needed to make bail from jail. So it seemed to me that students or demonstrators are ready to face whatever consequences from continuing this encampment. That's the sense that I get, but they are consistent and steadfast in their demands.
Hannah Reale, Cam Kettles, thank you so much to you both.
Thank you.
Thank you.
New guidelines now recommend mammogram screenings every other year starting at age 40, 10 years earlier than the last recommendation. This comes from the U.S. Preventive Services Task Force, an independent national panel of doctors, as rates of breast cancer begin to rise among younger women and people assigned female at birth. The vice chair of the task force, Dr. Wong from Tufts, joins me now, as does Dr. Michelle Specht, a breast surgical oncologist at Mass General Brigham and the co-director of MGH's Avon Comprehensive Breast Evaluation Center. Dr. Wong, Dr. Specht, thank you so much for being here. We mentioned at the top the change is a decade earlier that mammograms should start. What prompted this new recommendation? Dr. Wong, I'll go to you first.
Thanks so much. The key piece of the latest science shows that more women have been getting breast cancer in their 40s. And so it makes complete sense that starting screening earlier at age 40 would help women live longer and healthier lives. And I'll just make one correction. Our prior recommendation in 2016 did recommend that women could start screening in their 40s, but at that time there was a closer balance of benefit and harms. The number of women developing breast cancer in their 40s was lower, and so we encouraged women to have a discussion with their trusted healthcare professional about whether screening starting in the 40s would be appropriate for them. But now with this new evidence, it's pretty clear that all women should start screening every other year at age 40.
Thank you so much for that clarification. Dr. Specht, what does it mean for a woman to be one who is at average risk for breast cancer?
It's a great question. Normally, we think of average risk as someone who has a lifetime risk based on many different models that a woman's physician, whether they be their PCP or gynecologist, could use to estimate their risk. And these models include factors such as family history of breast cancer and certain types of exposures to various hormones, meaning how many children they had, when they got their period for their first time, whether they take hormone replacement therapy. And these models are something that physicians can use in their office to be able to evaluate a woman's risk. Again, if their lifetime risk is less than 20%, then the U.S. Health and Preventive Task Force recommends yearly mammograms starting at 40 every other year, not yearly, every other year. If someone's at elevated risk, and that could be between 15 and 20%, you could consider going yearly. And if they were at an elevated risk greater than 20%, then the American Cancer Society, American College of Radiologists tells us that we should add supplemental screening to that mammogram. So continue with your yearly mammogram, but add something like a breast MRI to that screening to help detect cancers that mammography may miss.
This question goes to either of you who can answer. I started to read a little bit, and it seemed like breast density had something to do with risk. And then I read maybe people think that if your breasts are smaller, then you're at higher risk and you may be more dense. But then I also read that that might not be true. But I have two doctors with me now, so tell me about breast density and risk.
I'd be happy to give the task force perspective on that, and I'm sure Dr. Specht would agree. Having dense breasts increases your risk for developing breast cancer. It also suggests that breast mammography may not work as well for these women. I will say that it still works, just not as well. And from the task force perspective, when we looked at the balance of benefits and harms of additional, say, MRI screening after a normal mammogram or ultrasound screening after a normal mammogram. Unfortunately, we could not find enough evidence to say whether or not that follow-up additional screening after a mammogram would provide sufficient benefit or harm. And so we call that an I statement. We desperately want to have the evidence to help inform women whether or not a supplemental screening following a normal mammogram would provide them benefit. Now, having said that, it's frustrating to know that we don't have the evidence, and we are crying for it. While we're waiting for that, we would encourage women who have dense breasts to have a conversation with their trusted healthcare professional and together make the decision that's right for them.
And Dr. Specht, following up on that, what's the way to know whether or not you're a woman with dense breasts?
Well, fortunately, in the state of Massachusetts and soon to be across the whole country, all women who get a mammogram will receive a letter that gives them the results of the mammogram, but also comments on their breast density. Breast density is a scale that goes from 1, not dense, and that includes mostly fatty breasts, to 4, extremely dense, and that's where most of the tissue is still breast tissue. We consider those that fall into category 3 and 4 dense, and those that are 1 and 2 not dense. And so centers like ours at Mass General, the Avon Breast Center, will evaluate patients who have dense breasts and will plug in their numbers to the breast cancer risk assessment model. And we can include their breast density to help determine their risk of getting a breast cancer in their future as part of this model, and then help guide their decisions about supplemental screening.
And for folks who might be concerned that starting earlier and having the mammogram procedure more often means more radiation exposure, how do we know that this is safe for women to start doing earlier and more regularly?
So the task force actually looked at this question, and we used simulation computer modeling to say, estimating the amount of radiation a woman gets from breast mammograms and the potential development of breast cancer related to that exposure. And we find that that risk for developing breast cancer from the radiation is small relative to the potential benefit. So it's clearly beneficial to have that screening mammogram to help women live longer, healthier lives. And again, if radiation is the concern, that should be a small piece of the decision.
I think I read it's about the same amount of radiation a person would expect to get from natural background exposure over 7 weeks. Does that sound right?
That sounds correct. Our newer imaging modalities using digital tomography is actually radiation that's less than it was traditionally when we used analog type of mammography. And even in the day when we had randomized controlled trials, which were performed, demonstrated an overall survival advantage to those women who were getting mammography. And so that did include the risks associated with radiation.
Switching gears a little bit now, we know from various research reports that while incident rates among Black and white women are close, the mortality rates are a bit different, with Black women having a higher death rate from cancer, and the factors that contribute to that are many. How might getting mammograms more often help to close that mortality gap? Dr. Wong?
You know, I'll say the task force is well aware of that. And we care deeply about this health disparity because we want all women to live longer, healthier lives. So we're well aware that Black women are 40% more likely to die from breast cancer than white women. Helping women get a first mammogram starting at age 40 every other year who are Black is a great first step, but it's not nearly enough to reduce the disparity. So we are desperately, urgently calling for more research to help us understand the cause of that disparity. We know that Black women get screened just as often, if not sometimes more often than white women, and yet we have this disparity in health outcomes. So we're calling for more research to help us understand why that might be. In the meantime, we're calling for effective, timely, and equitable follow-up after an abnormal screening mammogram. And if a woman should be diagnosed with breast cancer, making sure they have high-quality treatment for their breast cancer, working with their trusted healthcare professional to ensure that that is equitable, timely, appropriate, and effective.
And this next question is for both of you. Dr. Specht, I'll go to you first. And I'm going to get a little personal here. My last thing is just about healthcare access. I had a little situation where I thought something was wrong with my heart around the time of Thanksgiving. I went to a local emergency room. Everything was fine. But afterwards, I did want to establish a relationship with the PCP at that healthcare facility. And when I called to get myself an appointment, I was told I would have to wait a year before I could see a doctor. And then it was the same even when I looked around at other places. And intellectually, I knew that as a journalist, that preventative care is harder to come by just because of industry pressures, because of the pandemic. But now that I've experienced it, it's on my mind. And sometimes I'm just thinking, if it's hard for me as a person in a state with a world-class healthcare system to get a sort of standard appointment, I wonder, have we given any thought to what it means for the U.S. healthcare system that people who are trying to be proactive about their health seem to have a limited time with doctors now?
We're incredibly challenged with this. And I'll be perfectly honest, we're challenged right now with breast imagers. There's a huge workforce shortage, not only for PCPs, but people reading mammograms. The one thing that we know is the Affordable Care Act did tell us that all women, and it's always been 40 and older, can get a mammogram, so they can walk in to any facility and get a mammogram, and we serve them to get that mammogram, with or without, it's ideal when they have physicians treating them as a PCP or gynecologist. But I hope that will not hinder our ability to screen these women 40 and older because of the lack of access to primary care doctors and gynecologists. We need to encourage our young students to go to medical school and encourage them to pursue careers in this preventative care because it's such an important area to provide optimum care for all patients in an equitable fashion.
Dr. Wong, I'm sure you agree. Have you anything to add?
I'll just say, as a primary care internist, you're speaking to the, for me, heart of the matter. For the U.S. Preventive Services Task Force, we all have experience and expertise in primary care, and access to helping people stay healthy, live longer lives is the primary mission of the task force. And for example, we know during the pandemic, many women may have put off getting a breast mammogram. And I'll say, breast mammograms work. And if you haven't been screened in the past 2 years, go ahead and contact your primary care clinician and make an appointment for a mammogram would be my appeal.
Both of the doctors' words, Dr. John Wong, Dr. Michelle Specht, thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Finally tonight, if you saw the new film, The Challengers, you may have noticed a few familiar sights. That's because it was filmed mostly in eastern Massachusetts, transforming Wheaton College in Norton to Stanford University in California, Franklin Park's White Stadium into the Atlanta Open, and more. GBH's Haley Lerner sat down with the film's Boston-based location manager, Mark Fitzgerald, to learn more. She joins me now. Haley, thank you so much for being with me.
Thank you.
What did you learn from Mark Fitzgerald?
He told me all about the process of being on set for this film, and he has worked on pretty much most movies that have been set in Boston or filmed in Boston. He's been there. His first big movie was Good Will Hunting, so he really knows the game. And he told me a bit about how they search locations. The film revolves around tennis, so he had to make sure that there were tennis courts that they could film for this movie. And he really just was able to transform locations that are very Boston into some scenes all across the country for this big tennis movie.
And did you get a sense of why production companies look at the Boston area to film their productions here?
So for one, Boston has a lot of variety in the types of places they can film at. There's a lot of colleges. So in the case in this movie, they needed Stanford, so Wheaton College was a fill-in. But there's also woods, there's ocean, there's all different types of scenery and general suburbs and the Boston, of course, can fill in for New York and other major cities. So it really is versatile. But then there's also the film tax credits, which is something that started in 2006 that makes it so films and TV productions have a lot of initiative to film in the area. I believe they get back 25% in production credit, 25% in payroll credit, and they get sales tax breaks. So there's a lot of benefits, and it makes the cost of production a lot cheaper for productions.
And then what does that do for Boston's economy?
In Boston, so I remember it was the TV series Castle Rock. I saw a statistic that when that filmed here, for every $1 in production credit that was given, it brought a little bit under $5 back to the economy. So it brings a whole set of crew here, a whole production here that's money coming into the area, but also it employs the film and TV community here. There are a lot of college graduates working in film and TV in the Boston area, and so they have job opportunities here, and that's just hundreds and thousands of crew members that now have jobs in these local productions instead of on location in other places or in California. It really brings the industry here and gives people job opportunities here in that field.
And then going back to Mark Fitzgerald and how he makes his magic. What did you learn about that?
He has a whole portfolio in his mind and online of locations. And he did say, he was like, the one thing I don't have is tennis courts and locker rooms. So he had to find and film 1 million of those and, send them over to the director to make sure that he got the perfect ones. And if you see the movie, it looks very seamless. It all looks great on screen. And so his job was just finding those locations and then also on set every day coordinating and making sure that all the trucks and all the crews and everything can fit, especially in the city. That's, as you can imagine, quite a task. But he got to work closely with the director, with the set, with the cast. And, he said Zendaya was really nice. He brought his daughter on set one day, said she was great. So the whole experience was very cool for him, as all of his jobs are.
Did you have any feelings about hearing that Boston is cool enough and versatile enough to be a site for shooting? I don't know, I hear that and I think, there's nothing really distinct about the place. You can transform it.
Well, that's kind of why, yeah, I think it can be transformed. Mark Fitzgerald, he did say that his favorite thing to do is movies that are filming in Boston about Boston because he loves the city. He just shot The Instigators, which filmed about a year ago with Matt Damon and Casey Affleck, and he loved that because it was very Boston-centric. But I think movies, there is a bit of a blank slate here. There's some street in Boston that can kind of become any city. And so there's a lot to work with, but it is also fun for Fitzgerald to do movies that are actually about Boston.
Excellent. Haley Lerner, thank you so much.
Thank you.
That's it for tonight. We'll be back tomorrow. Thanks for watching. I'm Saraya Wintersmith. Good night.